The first Five Nights at Freddy's game is generally considered to be a fantastic horror game, and I've seen many YouTubers and FNAF fans call this one of the best games in the series, and an easy S tier.
I don't think there's anywhere I could put this other than peak. I had the time of my life playing Five Nights at Freddy's 1.
I have to put it at S though. It's FNAF 1, it's a classic. There's no way I'm not putting that at S. I don't care. I'll fight anyone for it. It's the game that started it all. It feels wrong to be putting it anywhere else but S.
But after playing through the game on several occasions, I do not understand the hype around this game. The game has many glaring issues that make it a lot less enjoyable than people make it out to be, and I never really hear people talk about these issues. Personally, I think this game has a lot of problems that make the newer games a lot more fun than this one, and this is by no means my favourite Five Nights at Freddy's game. And in this video, I'm going to talk about why I think it's overrated, and some of the problems I have with the first Five Nights at Freddy's game, so I hope you enjoy the video. The first issue with Five Nights at Freddy's comes down to what is largely considered to be its strongest feat: the atmosphere. This game is really considered to have a brilliant atmosphere and one of the best in the series, but there are some problems that, again, no one seems to talk about. And one of the biggest ones is the way the animatronics are handled. They are not done particularly well. Sure, there's something scary about them slowly making their way towards your office, but once they're there, they just sit at the door. Once you realize that, oh, you need to close the door on them, you spend a lot of the night just waiting for them to leave. Because their AI values are so low, on the earlier nights they will just camp your doors, which breaks the tension because frankly them just sitting there is not only not that scary, but also just gets annoying because they're draining your power and there's nothing really happening. One of my biggest problems with Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is that the game can get quite slow and boring, and although breaks in tension is brilliant for Five Nights at Freddy's 1 atmosphere, and much better than a game like FNAF 2, it can almost get too broken up to where nothing's actually happening, especially on the earlier nights. And this partly boils down to the fact that the animatronics don't do a lot. They move around the building, which is creepy, but in terms of actually attacking you, they'll make their way to the door and either you lose, or they just camp while they drain your power, and there's nothing you can do about it, which gets annoying once you realize how they work. Another problem is the jump scares. They are not done well, and I think they are very overrated. A lot of people complain about security breaches jump scares because you see them coming. You know an animatronic is chasing you, you know you're about to die. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 might actually do this worse, and a lot of people don't talk about it. But when an animatronic kills you, they deactivate your lights in your door, so you can't check the light, you can't close the door. And this is incredibly stupid because it removes the suddenness of the jump scare. Because anybody who knows that's how they work, if you lose access to your light, you're dead. The jump scare is expected. You just pull up the camera, pull it down, and yep, you got jump scared. Wow. I know that when you first play the game, you don't know this, but anybody who plays the game and knows this will just not get scared by the jump scare, because the moment you find out you can't open your light, oh well, you're dead. And that kind of removes a lot of the fear of the jump scare. And the jump scares themselves, they're good, but I think they're a little overrated. Nostalgia obviously carries them, they're iconic, but objectively, they're not actually that scary. Better than UCN's, probably, but I'd take FNAF 4 and Sister Location, and as much as security breaches aren't great, I honestly think they're scarier. Foxy is pretty good though. I'll give Foxy credit because he doesn't deactivate the light and his jump scare is pretty cool. And Golden Freddy is cool, although I've never actually had him in the game, so I don't know. Another thing I really don't like about Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is how slow the game is. I'm sure a lot of people who've played Five Nights at Freddy's also have this complaint, but the game is just kind of boring. Because the mechanics are so simple, it means that anybody can pick up and play the game, which is nice for a first playthrough, but once you know what you're doing, the game gets very repetitive and dull. UCN is a good example because it has the complete opposite problem. So many controls and mechanics make new players incredibly confused, and I know that controls menu is often pretty scary for a first time playthrough, but it means that by the end of the game, once you know what you're doing, it's a lot more fun and a lot more interesting. This game has the opposite problem, where it's super easy to learn, but doesn't get that deep and is pretty boring once you know what you're doing, because you're just repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Another thing that's good about this game is that it doesn't have a lot of RNG, but that does mean the night gets very repetitive. Playing Five Nights at Freddy's 1 can often just be doing the same thing over and over again. Check the light, flip the camera, check the light again, repeat. FNAF 4 also has this problem, but there's more mechanics to cycle through, so it's not particularly good in either game, but I think FNAF 4 does it better. And then games like FNAF 2 and 3 have way too much RNG, so there's not really a right balance in any of the first 4 games. But unfortunately, Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is no exception, and it can make the game feel pretty dull. And 9 minutes for the nights is outrageous. It gets very boring, and I think shortening it to 6 minutes for the later games was a smart decision. Yes, it's the first game in the series, I understand that, but that doesn't make it any better. Another problem with this game is that it really doesn't have a lot going for it. 4 animatronics is nice, but they all virtually do the same thing since you're just closing the door on them when they reach you. There is some variety between Foxy and Freddy, but overall the mechanic is the same. You check on the robot, and when they're not, where you want them to be, close the door. And that can get pretty boring and uninteresting after a while. Other games, there's a lot more mechanics, a lot more animatronics, and things get more interesting. This game doesn't have that, and it makes the nights feel pretty much the same. I would argue night 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all pretty much the same in mechanics, and they can get incredibly boring and just feel repetitive.
Wow, someone actually showed up.
Yes, I'm a little biased because I have 100% this game in a marathon, which that kind of setting can make the nights feel incredibly boring, but even before that I never really enjoyed playing through this game, and it often just felt really boring seeing the same thing over and over again for every single night. The custom night does spice things up a bit, so I can appreciate that. 420 mode's nice, and I like the 1987 jump scare, but really, because all the animatronics play basically the same, and because stalling means the AI doesn't really change much, the gameplay can feel the same. And I should probably mention stalling because there are a lot of ways to break FNAF 1, and although you don't have to use them, it's the most optimal strategy, and it's really the only way to beat the later nights, which it's not particularly interesting. While other games also have stalling, it's done a lot better, and there's still other challenge, but 420 mode is so easy, and it's by far the most boring max mode in the entire series, which makes the game not particularly replayable. Meanwhile, Night 1 is pretty boring, and while it's not the worst Night 1, I mean, FNAF 3 exists, it's still pretty lame to get through, and again, makes playthroughs not that fun. And then there's the power mechanic, which, to be honest, I don't mind, but part of the problem with the power mechanic is that it means that you are actively encouraged to do nothing, which is not a great way to play Five Nights at Freddy's 1, because the best thing to do is to save power. You will spend a large portion of the game doing absolutely nothing, which is not only boring, but also just really unnecessary. At least in games like FNAF 2, the sort of AFK slower task is winding the music box, but in this game, you're just sitting there doing nothing, and it's pretty boring. Other games have this problem, like Five Nights at Freddy's 6, or Pizza Sim, I guess, but this game really does just fail to keep your interest for the entire game, because you will just spend a lot of time AFK, either waiting for animatronics to leave your doors, or just trying to save power, especially on the earlier nights. And although I like the idea of saving power, I think a lot of the other games, like Sister Location and UCN, do the power better than this one. Even still, this game does obviously have some positives. I think the lore is probably one of the strongest parts about this game, because it's simple but still interesting. It keeps the FNAF story we know today because of all the missing children incident and the stuff it introduced, but most of the lore was introduced in Five Nights at Freddy's 2. That's when we first met William Afton and learned a lot more about the story, and because of that, FNAF 1's story is a bit basic. I mean, FNAF is known for having some of the most cryptic and confusing lore out there, and yet this game doesn't have a whole lot. but I think for what it is, it's a fine enough game. I think the animatronic designs are also really cool, and I do like the sound design, but one of my problems is that most of the sound design and atmosphere means nothing. The animatronics, staring at you in the cameras, it's creepy, and the noises being played are definitely scary, but most of them mean nothing. And the moment you realize that, the atmosphere starts to break apart. It's scary when you hear the music box playing in one of the other rooms. Once you realize that means nothing, you start to ignore it, and the atmosphere, well, once it's getting ignored, it's nowhere near as strong. This is a game that does a fantastic job at setting a first impression. When you first play the game and don't know what anything means, it is generally pretty scary. But the moment you realize that all the different creepy visual effects and sound design doesn't mean anything, becomes a lot less scary. I mean, the fan with its incredibly loud and annoying whirring throughout the entire night is definitely unsettling, but you get used to it and it starts to get drowned out. To be honest, I don't really notice it when playing anymore, and again, if you're ignoring the atmosphere, it's not going to be particularly strong. Also, this game just does not have a lot of content. I mean, I kind of touched upon this earlier, but with only 4 animatronics, the only other night's repetitive, but there's only 7 nights, and the custom night all feels pretty much the same. And yes, this is the first game, it's the cheapest game, but objectively, the other games have more going for it. This game doesn't really have collectibles, there's no multiple endings, no mini-games, no cutscenes. There really is nothing besides 7 nights, and as far as FNAF games go, that's not only pretty boring, but also the game is just not that hard, so you really won't spend that long. At least with UCN, you'll spend like at least 30 hours on it just trying to beat 50-20 mode, but this game can be beaten in just over an hour pretty easily. And if you know what you're doing, it's one of the shortest and most simple FNAF games. I'm not saying that this is a huge fault, again it's the first game in the series, and for what it has is fine, but other games objectively have more going for them. And I think Help Wanted is a great example. I know a lot of people have problems with Help Wanted, but literally one of the games is FNAF 1. Yes, it's not as good as FNAF 1, but it has so much else going for it that I can't really see this game ever being better than Help Wanted. The lore, story, and creepy atmosphere, as well as the VR in Help Wanted, is far better than FNAF 1. And I really do not see the hype around Five Nights at Freddy's 1 when Help Wanted 1 exists. And Help Wanted 2, although not as scary, still has a decent atmosphere with the whole taking off the mask section, and the minigames are super fun, so again, I'd take that over this game any day of the week. And it really just comes down to the fact that this game is just quite boring to play. Repetitive, slow, and pretty mind-numbing at points because it just isn't that fun. This is a visual game that you will enjoy if you watch it on YouTube. I'm sure the Markiplier videos are still incredible to this day, although I haven't seen many of them, but unfortunately, the game isn't that fun to play, and I'm sure that a lot of people who rank this as an S tier game probably haven't played past Night 2. Seriously, go play the entire game if you really disagree in my opinion, because I do think the Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is not that fun to play. And although it has many other strong suits, if a game isn't fun to play, it's not going to be particularly enjoyable. And because of that, Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is not as good as people say it is. I think the game is just too carried by nostalgia. Again, I'm sure it was fun in 2014, but objectively, there's not too much going for it. And here's another thing about Five Nights at Freddy's 1. This game is not that scary. I know a lot of people say it's one of the scariest games in the series, and obviously Markiplier's iconic scariest game ever made title is still pretty iconic to this day, but objectively, this is not the scariest Five Nights at Freddy's game. I think a lot of the fear came from the fact that we didn't know what any of these animatronics did. You know, we kind of obviously get an idea, but back then, this was a completely new, never before seen type of horror game that was incredibly unique and incredibly interesting. But nowadays, we've seen it. We've seen the same animatronics and the same ideas used time and time again, and although it was really novel back then, I honestly think a lot of the reason the newer games are considered to be less scary is just because people know what's happening. One of the strongest fears is fear of the unknown, and nowadays we know. We know all about the animatronics, we know about the lore, and it makes the games less scary. FNAF 1 is also not that scary anymore. It was back in the day, but nowadays it's not that scary, and it's unfair to judge this game based on how good it was in 2014, when we still judge the newer games by how good they are now, a few years after they've come out. So, yeah, Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is just not the greatest FNAF game. I understand a lot of what makes it so fun, and I get nostalgia plays a part, but calling this great because it was the first game and introduced everything isn't fair when the other games continue this game's legacy so much better. It's definitely got a strong atmosphere, some decent lore, and it's good for its time, but the other games are more fun. I would rather play most of the other FNAF games, and that is really what matters. Seriously, go play Five Nights at Freddy's 1 again, because the game hasn't held up as well as people say it is, and I would not consider this to be the best FNAF game, or even in the top 5. Obviously, this is all my opinion. These are some nitpicks I have with the game. If you disagree, which I'm sure many of you will, feel free to leave your opinions in the comments. I wasn't here in 2014, I was not a FNAF fan, so I don't have that same nostalgia for the game, but objectively, this game is just not as good as people say it is. So yeah, that's my thoughts on why Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is overrated. Hope you guys enjoyed this kind of video. I've been trying out a new style, and I hope to do more videos like this. And hey, maybe I'll rank all the Five Nights at Freddy's games at one point. But if I do, you can be sure FNAF 1 is not making it anywhere near S tier.